My overall take is that the book is morally obscene and it's egregiously non-objective. And what makes it egregiously non-objective isn't just the concrete examples of how he's willfully not looking at important facts. He's not concerned with truth. And that's a fundamental.
They're left in this kind of half war, half not war state of misery, which is the state that these people have subsisted in for all this time. And why have they subsisted in this for all this time? Because of ideologues like Coates and all the others who are obscuring the kind of moral clarity that would be needed to end this war.
I know there's some documents that have just came out recently that give us way more of a picture of the type of thing that's envisioned or the goal of Hamas or the Palestinian people. That is nothing, absolutely nothing like the Black American vision for the future.
How is it that he can't really see that he's on the side of the Confederates this time? It's him who's now saying he's for heritage, not hate.
Welcome to ARI Bookshelf. I'm Elan Journo. I'm joined today by my colleague Greg Salmieri, and we're also happy to have Mohamed Ali and Ibis Slade to talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message.
Let's talk about this book, though, in particular, and how it's structured. So it's a series of 4 essays, but they're really leading up to and framing this final essay, which is a reflection on his trip to Israel and a sort of mea culpa for the one thing he ever did that said anything positive about anything, which is in the case for reparations, he had cited German reparations to the state of Israel as an example of what it might look like for a society to make a positive step of committing restitution. Can't America do this to Black citizens in a similar way? And he's gotten flack for that, and he's felt kind of ashamed and embarrassed since that he said something pro-Israel. And that's a lot of the framing for what's going on in this book. He talks about his career as a writer and his different things he's done, and about his experience with a kind of Black nationalist father, and how that reflects his thinking on nationalism. And these series of essays that are developing themes, and then it all kind of comes to a head in this story of his trip to Israel and Palestine, or to Israel and the West Bank, let's say, and his reflections on it, and etc. So that's the kind of framing of the book, and it's, again, in part he's explaining and apologizing for his positive statements about Israel in the past. He writes of himself as trying to seek moral clarity. He talks about how he's grown in his view as a journalist over time, and his approach to dealing with moral issues now, how it's different from what it was when he was first starting out, and then when he wrote this piece, The Case for Reparations. And he comes with a certain kind of worldview, a certain project to look at the West Bank and to look at Israel. And this is sort of what we're seeing. So what are people's overall broad perspective on what he's doing in the book as a whole, and what in particular the role of this last largest essay on Israel is?
I want to jump in with this. So my overall take is that the book is morally obscene and it's egregiously non-objective. And what makes it egregiously non-objective isn't just the concrete examples of how he's willfully not looking at important facts. He's not concerned with truth. And that's a fundamental. And it's egregious as well because it's framed from the opening essay as a letter to young writers. And here's the importance of language and writing, and how you can become an agent for exposing the truth and becoming a moral crusader, as he has become or seen to be. And so this is supposed to be modeling what young people should be doing. And this is the farthest thing. It's the opposite of what it looks like to take morality seriously and truth seriously. And this is just, it runs through the book from start to finish. And I'll just to concretize it very briefly before I hand over the mic to you guys. This book came out just in the last few weeks, as far as I know. And that is ample time for a publisher to add an afterword or to add a preface that says, since this book was written, something major happened in this part of the world. It's October 7th, the war that unfolded since then. And this is a massive world-changing event that you would want to think about if what your goal is to understand and evaluate the issue that he describes as the Palestine-Israel conflict. And there isn't even there's nothing like that. There's not even a mention of Hamas or the PLO or any of their leaders. There is nothing, and it's that silence is deafening, and that's part of, it's not the only reason, but it's one small example of why this book is so morally obscene in my view.
To just real quick to bolster that concretization, I found it egregious when a lot of his interviews on this issue, when the topic of a solution or some suggestion of where he thinks we should go from here, he flips off on whether he does have a solution or not. But what he does say is that for a solution, any solution isn't possible unless we include Palestinian voices. And he doesn't mention Hamas and talk about much about Palestinian culture, but it seems to me that's a major unserious way to approach the moral qualms and controversies embedded in this issue. It's egregious to say something like you mentioned after these attacks, and to put forward the need for possibly the attackers or people who support this attack, which we saw there's some significant amount of support in Palestine, as I understand it, that for any solution to be possible or to be even thought of, these are the voices to be heard. I mean, it's tandem to say, we have to hear from the Southerners or the Confederates during the Reconstruction period or after the Civil War. It's a little silly. It's very silly and disgusting, to be honest.
And it's precisely the kind of thing that somebody who was morally serious, taking his line about brackets and what things are in and out of the brackets and how do you frame it, would take seriously. But he doesn't, right? So he has this idea that there's something right about it, that there's a kind of cop-out when journalists are claiming to be objective. Oh, we're going to hear from both sides, and you find someone who says A and someone who says not A. But of course, you've done a lot of thinking about which A and not A, which people are you going to include, and so he exposes that and says, look, we're not, there's no easy objectivity where you just show both sides, because there are lots of sides, and you figure out who you're going to interview and who you're going to show, and that's part of a journalist's work, and people hide from that. You can do it differently. You can put the frames or the brackets in different places. But then, okay, where should you put them? How do you determine whether you should put them? I'm not willing to hear things that I regard as self-evidently morally obscene. Okay, well, are you willing to consider why people think that the West Bank needs to be occupied? Are you willing to consider why there are these security measures there? Are you willing to consider, like, is that obscene, or what is the obscene thing? And what is in fact obscene is evading the fact that you have missiles constantly being fired on a country for generations. You have periodic terrorism against it, and no thought about is any kind of response to this justified or why? And there's a sense in which he's not offering a solution, but it is clear what he thinks the solution is. He thinks that the state of Israel is illegitimate, that it shouldn't exist, and there are various kind of details or issues of how you get rid of it. But there's no. I mean, that's the essence of of his solution. He has the same solution as Hamas.
Yeah.
And he says on some interviews, oh, of course, I'm horrified by what happened on October 7. How could anybody think I would like that? I don't mention it in my book, of course. For some reason, it slipped my mind. But of course, how could anybody? But the reason why people think he thinks that and wonder what he thinks about it and ought to wonder is because he has precisely the same goals. And he doesn't breathe a word against it unless directly pushed on it, and then in the most mealy-mouthed politician-like tones. This is a kind of massive evasion of your responsibility. He thinks of what writers are doing is seeking clarity, trying to clarify issues, trying to bring moral clarity. And he's on fire about that issue. And there's something right about that you don't want to write in a morally neutral tone and have no, you hem and haw about how complex things are. But you also don't want to evade the facts. And you can't achieve clarity by making it up, by selectively putting things in the frame, and by not thinking about what the whole context is and then pretending you are. And yes, you don't interview or present as reasonable views that are unreasonable, but you actually think about what they are and about whether there's a point to them. And you have to test and really, actively consider what the views are that think your views are monstrous, and think about them. And there's no real sign of his doing that. There's rather a reflexive, these Israelis sound like white racists to me, and my dad always thought they were like white racists. And now I feel bad that I said something against them when I was around some Jewish journalists who made me feel like that was an okay thing to do. So now I'm coming back to my roots.
To put a real quick... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, there's the line in the essay where he says that he felt the solidarity of conquered peoples. And so what you all have pointed out is that there's a pretense at moral clarity here. But if we ask ourselves, well, why do we think he's doing this? So why do we think it takes a lot of effort not to talk about October 7th in this book? Why do we think he's doing this? I think that in his work, and in this particular essay, it became clear to me, although there are hints of it earlier, there is just part of what makes him such a powerful writer is his deep interest in humiliation and oppression, and his ability to convey as a writer, to make you feel what he feels. And there's a lot in this book that talks about when he's at a checkpoint and talks about like how horrific the border wall is, and he describes it in language that's really menacing and large and scary. The beginning of the essay, he's in a Holocaust museum, and he's talking about how seeing what he saw there made him lose even more hope in the world. He talks about this yawning black chasm. There's a real... You're left with the sense that something about humiliation, something about feeling on the outside of things resonates with him in a way that I think might motivate him to then go on and like overlook the horrors of October 7th, to overlook all those, the leadership of Hamas or the Palestinian authorities. I need to find some story to figure out why it is that he's doing all this work that he's doing, to avoid talking about what not just people who know about objectivism or Ayn Rand, but like CBS anchor, like confront him with this. There's something we need to make sense of. And I really think that there's something in him that pushes him more towards people that he thinks of as humiliated or denigrated.
There's a worldview that centers being a victim. And it's how he thinks about black people. He says he doesn't, but it is. It's how he thinks about Palestinians. And occasionally he catches himself. Oh, to be a Palestinian is more than being a victim, he says at one point. Yeah, what? What more do you think it is, Ta-Nehisi? What more is it than being a victim? Because everything you've said about them has to do with their being a victim. Oh, and they have a nice hummus dish. And then something about how they deal with being a victim. And if you look at all the people he writes about, everyone he admires, it's almost always perseverance in the face of victimhood, noble bearing of victimhood, reasonable mistakes people make in the face of their victimhood, but no actual overcoming victimhood, no actual achievements, other than maybe, a perspective in the case of victimhood. It's the meek. I admire the meek and how they shall inherit the earth. It's a very Christian and therefore nihilistic worldview.
Yeah. Can I jump in on something here too? Because I think it's important that to capture this, how he doesn't talk about October 7th. And since my focus is thinking about how his historical thinking works, I also find it interesting to go along with his kind of good blindness. In one of his interviews, he's kind of asked, or the question comes around like, is there any right way to found a state or something? I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And he says, states aren't founded by rights. They're founded by force. And it's, there's a lot of historical examples that would lead you to think that. But if he's so focused on Black history, it's interesting to me that he doesn't see the Reconstruction period, as short as it is, even with the standard view that I slightly disagree with, that it was overthrown. He still doesn't see that as a founding of a nation or the starting of a system from a right perspective, from a moral perspective. It just seems the only thing that seems to be salient for him is that force was used. And in fact, force had to be used. And I think
indeed,
part of this
it's strange that I saw that interview as well, and he was adamant to point out, look, yeah, states are formed by force. But if you notice, just in his career, the two states that he's criticized, the United States and Israel, like, of all the states formed by... those are, those are your paradigm examples of things formed by force and not by ideas or the force of good, and the force of good ideas or good aspirations that people had. There is something here about who are you choosing to criticize? And like, you're just the United States and, the only democracy in the Middle East. And he denigrates the idea that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. And he doesn't think that that's substantial or important or absolves it of the injustices that it does. And insofar as there are injustices, they're much less than he thinks they are. And no state should be absolved of them. But it's just those two states in his career, those are the ones he saw fit to criticize. And they're the ones that took morality more seriously than your average states. It's not
the model for the right way to go.
It's not. It's for him. America is the model of evil, racism, and oppression. Right. Notice that he constantly analogizes in showing what's wrong with Israel to America, and not just to some aspects of America, but his read on American societies. It's fundamentally unjust, and it's a force for injustice in the world. And that's part of what he's damning Israel for. The value stake of this project for him is that showing what's wrong with Israel is a way to kind of what he thinks is wrong with it. He can show it by reference to America and villainize America more by doing it. This is a anti-American screed. And now, why is it that, right? What's the gravity towards that? There's no view, again, of a positive founding. And there's, importantly, no interest in the view of a positive founding of a state. So it's not America should have done this or could have done that, or if Israel had done this, or if the people, the only things he has to say are negatives. And I think it's really significant to his worldview, and it's significant to the worldview of a kind of intellectual he represents, who is, I sometimes call this grievance pimping, around African-American history and around Palestinian history. I'll say what I mean by grievance pimping in a little bit. But the other place where you really see this clearly is with Nicole Hannah-Jones. And there's a really fascinating interview of the two of them some years ago by Ezra Klein. There's also a more recent interview of Coates by Klein about this book. But this is back around the time of the 1619 Project. And what really comes out from both Coates and Jones in this interview with Klein back some years ago is that both of them have a kind of feel enlightened or deep or woke in that they aren't living under the delusion that other Americans are, particularly white Americans, but even some black Americans like Jones's father who had a pro-American flag attitude and so forth, that the society they live in is fundamentally just. They've seen through that. They know that the society isn't just. They don't buy the myth. And it's not in dint of some recognition of some other just society. The USSR was good, or some future, what the Nation of Islam wants would be good, or something like that. No, the aspiration for, the interest in a just society is itself somehow naive or foolish. But if you've really given up on that, if you don't have that as central to your worldview, this is what a just society would be. And our society is unjust because we don't have it. All you can do is say, look at that cop, he's a racist, and look at how redlining worked, and look at this border wall, and look at this and look at that. What is your talk of injustice? There's no positive ideal to which it is, or at least no earthly ideal. Like, it's what Jesus might have wanted, or it's what you could envision, but there's no aspiration towards it. The only thing that it serves to do is to denigrate existing societies. And that's why I say it's a kind of nihilism. And I mentioned this term kind of grievance pimping. I mean, there's a phenomenon of taking a population that's suffering and ill-served and in a bad situation, and taking that fact about them as, making a big sound about it, really calling attention to it, and calling on it as a call to sacrifice for other people and a way to damn people around them who may or may not, in some cases they are, but in some cases they're not, guilty of contributing to this, but without any positive vision of what can be done to help these people, of what they would need to do and what other people would need to stop doing for them to be better off. And I think that the Palestinians are the greatest victims in recent history of this kind of a movement. Many of them are complicit in it, so sometimes they're their own victims. But you have decades and decades of a people who nobody is actually trying to come up with a solution that would make these people have a decent life in a decent kind of society. They're of value to ideologues among themselves and among others as something you can use to put down the West and to put down Israel and to put down America. And so long as they're suffering and miserable, they serve this purpose. And it's this kind of ideology that is responsible for the fact that all the money, all the support, all the goodwill of other people, all their own resources go into building tunnels to make them a threat to the people next to them, such that those people next to them have to be afraid, have fences up, have walls, have a wall of devouring, as Coates calls it, which is a bunch of guard dogs. And he thinks, like, people must be really scared to have a wall of devouring. Why are they really scared? Well, because there are people trying to kill and rape and destroy them and wipe them off the face of the earth right next to them. And the people aren't stopping doing that. They're not becoming pacified. They're not becoming what real pacification means in a war, which is giving up this ideal and taking on another one of what kind of society can be made here. The people in the world supporting them are not supporting them in any kind of aspiration for a decent life for themselves in peace with their neighbor. What they're supporting them is in a kind of self-destructive grievance that makes them a threat to themselves and their neighbors, and makes their neighbors have to try to fight back against them, but not be willing to fully fight back against them and defeat them, such that they're left in this kind of half war, half not war state of misery, which is the state that these people have subsisted in for all this time. And why have they subsisted in this for all this time? Because of ideologues like Coates and all the others who are preventing, obscuring the kind of moral clarity that would be needed to end this war.
And I think this touches on what I was getting at him being seen as the serious person, the serious thinker on these issues, especially on some of the racial stuff. A lot of what bothers me is the seeking out Coates for a worldview that wipes out any type of a real sense of Black progress or genuine sense of Black progress in America. So I think it's important to note that while you just gave a description of the Palestinian, how it's hard to sort out if the Palestinian cause is how many people have a positive view for wanting to live a life of flourishing, of success, of production, whereas for him it seems like that type of thing, which is prevalent in the Black community, prevalent in the Black struggle, is not mentioned at all. All of his parallels, which I think makes this parallel not only inaccurate and invalid, but just disgusting. It's a disgusting parallel to try and put the Palestinian cause to the Black cause when there was this exactly the opposite of what seems to be the majority of the Palestinian cause here. Is there was a rational approach to get real infrastructure into society, to get proper laws, to get proper protection so we could live lives, to even in some ways maybe it was kind of deleterious. They were so willing to just trying to get to the point where they wanted to live, on equal par with white people, that they were willing to kind of set certain grievances aside to not, punish Confederates and Southerners. But that is tremendously different than from what I take, especially Elan's way more knowledgeable on this, what seems to come out of the Palestinian desire through things like the Hamas Charter and some of I know there's some documents that have just came out recently that give us way more of a picture of the type of thing that's envisioned, or the goal of Hamas or the Palestinian people. That is nothing, absolutely nothing like the Black American vision for the future.
More than that, what it is like is the other guys in the story, right? Like, yeah. It's the Confederacy that longs for the days, before these foreigners came in and like ransacked their beautiful way of life. There was this section in the book, in Coates, in the essay we're discussing, where a man who has lost his estate is sort of ruminating and dwelling on how horrible it is that, an estate that he had in his family for generations could be really quick could quickly disappear. And it just reminds you of this kind of like Gone with the Wind lore where like things were really great and everyone was so tranquil until these foreigners came in and just disrupted everything. And with no thought that like really the parallels here are with the Confederacy. So you had in both cases a feudal system that was really racist and very ethnically exclusive, and replaced by a modernized industrial nation that had that were a lot less racist. And insofar as there are racist elements in Israel, they're the sorts of things that can be corrected by what's good about the society. And the same is true for the U.S. as well. But it's that he could invert it so shamelessly is there's something really puzzling that we still, I think, have to reconcile. So how is it that he can't really see that he's on the side of the Confederates this time? It's him who's now saying he's for heritage, not hate.
The lost causes.
To what's been said, particularly your comments, Greg, one way I think of the view that Coates is operating on is he fetishizes suffering, and there's other people suffering, and then it's worth adding that the way this is written, it's a memoir with a kind of undercurrent that's supposed to be an argument, and I put it that way deliberately because it's not really an argument, and it's difficult to take it seriously, but nevertheless there's a view he wants you to take from it. It's self-indulgent. It's a recounting of his own experiences, and he has to go sit down because he's overcome with his emotions, and he's overwhelmed by some sadness, and he can't take this moment with a group of people, so he goes and retreats to some quiet solitude. And if that's what you're looking for, a readout of his emotions, this is what this book offers in plenty. But it's revealing in terms of his methodology, his thinking approach, which I think it goes along with this fetishizing of suffering. So what stands in his mind as moral thinking is, I think, really just reacting to suffering with very strong emotions. And if your emotion is very strong because you see people suffering and within a very narrow frame you think this is suffering, that's got to be wrong. They're obviously the victims. And it's morality through emotional filtering. It's not morality through thought. And I think that's a deep flaw in his thinking. And he's not unique. This is a common view, but it comes through very powerfully through this book. And I think this ties into the non-objectivity that runs through the rest of the essay that we're focusing on, where he's trying to analogize Israel to the sort of worst racist aspects of American history. And that is, he doesn't want to think about certain things, so he doesn't think about them. He doesn't want to see certain things, so he doesn't, but he wants to find things that fit his reaction. So he surfaces all kinds of examples of what he regards as evidence of Israel's injustice and racial identity and the worst aspects of what you could point to in America's history. But it's highly selective. It's selective to the point of being ludicrous. And the omissions are so gigantic that you don't have to be an expert in this subject. You don't have to have studied it in depth to ask yourself, and you raised some of these questions earlier, Greg, why is there a wall between Israel and parts of the West Bank? Why was it erected 20 years ago? And why is it designed a certain way? Why are there guard dogs in certain places? Like, is it just that these people have a fetish for walls? And no, there's a history to this. There was a spate of attacks, suicide bombers. There was free flow of people before the wall was there. So what happened to stop that? And was it just completely random? And they thought, oh, this is an interesting way to punish people. No, there's a whole story he doesn't want to think about. And the other omission, just at a very surface level, we already mentioned the silence about October 7th. Put that aside. The other piece of the story that he has no interest in is that there's not simply one Palestinian community in Israel. It isn't exhausted by East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the so-called occupied territories. Gaza has been a Palestinian territory, much more of a state than the West Bank has been in terms of its ability, the level of its sovereignty in terms of how much control Hamas has had there since 2006, versus the West Bank, which has had shrinking levels of sovereignty because the incipient state didn't survive. It collapsed on itself, became an authoritarian regime, and Israel stepped back in and took greater control than it had ceded in the early 90s. So why is that? Why is he not interested in Gaza at all? Because many people with his disposition would focus on Gaza as it's an open-air prison. This is one of the talking points, which it is not an open-air prison. It's not the right way to think of this. And you mentioned the rockets. Most of those rockets came from Gaza. He's not interested in that. And the kind of society that has grown up in Gaza is it is a Palestinian society. It has the fundamental characteristics that you find in the West Bank as well, both ideologically and culturally. But it is distinct. It is in some ways worse than the West Bank because it is more insular, and it has become more ideologically perverse in the direction of Islamic control. So that you would want to know. He went through. Why didn't he get a tour of Gaza? He was there when you could still go in. The war wasn't raging when he visited. Why didn't he go there? Why is he not interested in that? Why is he not interested in the fact that they throw gay men off roofs and they persecute atheists and they've hounded Christians out of Gaza? Why is he not interested in any of that? Those kinds of behaviors are exactly the kind of behaviors that resemble lynching because they actually lynch people. Yeah. And those kinds of behaviors are exactly the kind of racialized tribal thinking that animated the aspects of the Confederacy, and then since then the people who would not give up on that cause. Now, why would you not want to think about that? That is a massive gap in his. I think it's a deliberate one, and that is part of why I think the whole approach of this book, it's not an honest attempt to understand the issue and to point towards a moral conclusion. And what you're raising about the absence of a positive, I think, goes along with that. Because if you had a positive, you would want to know. It would lead you to, well, how do I get to this positive? No, I think what animates this is, the way you're characterizing it is exploiting people who can be seen as victims in order to denigrate something that is actually good. And that's sort of an inversion of values. And I think that's a really important point to take from this book.
It's a powerful point. Can I offer, and we can go on after this to another point, but I just want to offer this, I think, useful kind of heuristic for thinking about this, which touches on the point Mohamed and Elan just made, is especially like some of this relying on this kind of emotionally filtered morality. It's like, what if, for those who know a little bit about the Civil War, this should resonate. If you walked into the South right after, and this, in fact, is a part of the lost cause myth, if you walked into the South after Sherman's, march through the South, where he basically lived off the land and used the Northern Army to, destroy Southern society to make sure his soldiers could get the job done, you would be, and the Southerners were very adamant, look at the horror. Look at our civilization. Look at our, like Mohammed mentioned, look at all our houses and our beautiful plantations. They're all ruined. Our equipment's ruined. But like Elan's bringing up, well, why is it like that? Is it maybe because you guys had a slave society that was built on force and conquest, and that's why it ended up getting destroyed? Coates is using this type of thing, and which I think goes along with what Mohammed's pointing out, where it's you are purveying some type of lost cause-esque mode of thinking and coming in midstream and banking on this kind of emotionally filtered moral view that's completely distorts the events and why we're in this situation that we are, and drops context completely.
Apartheid is not, apartheid is a word that he uses. Apartheid is not the only time in which a population is forced to submit to a government that they don't choose. Reconstruction, the period of Reconstruction is such an example, and maybe we need a term.
Coates thinks there's no such thing as a moral occupation. So.
Right. So he's got a, but he also thinks it ended too early because that's what one of his other works was about. Right. So there's no that I think is something to push back on. So one way you could think of the strictures and the restrictions on populations in the West Bank you could go like Coates and think that they are some kind of apartheid. Alternatively, what Greg has sort of been pointing out is thinking of it as like a war that's frozen or unfinished in time. And if you think of like that occupation as some kind of like thwarted reconstruction, like a reconstruction that just never got off the ground, then you can explain like why it looks like it has the features that Coates thinks are troubling and looks like apartheid without granting it that kind of dishonor. There are such things as populations that you just need to, in times of war, to have a military occupation of, and there needs to be more thinking and more thought by intellectuals and military leaders about how to do that well. But to think that that's not what Israel's doing and that it's engaging in a kind of South Africa style apartheid, I don't think he knows too much of American history, as Ibis is pointing out, to know that there are alternatives to that kind of conception of what's going on.
There are such things as successful occupations. Here are two. The American and, in general, Western ally occupation of Germany after World War II, and the American occupation of Japan after World War II. And both of those occupations successfully reconstructed those societies as peaceful societies that were no longer at war with or threats to the people that had to fight back against them and invade them to protect themselves. The Reconstruction in the South was a semi-successful Reconstruction. It was successful in not having the South secede again and wage war, but it wasn't successful in fully undoing the racist society racist feudal society that led the South to want to secede in the first place. And it wasn't fully successful about that because the North itself wasn't committed to that goal because they didn't fully believe in it. There were people who did, but they didn't. And that's why they let Jim Crow reemerge and let it become semi-feudal and therefore still poor and backwards by comparison to the North years later, right? So the Reconstruction of the South was semi-successful, but not fully, and with tragic consequences. But we have ones that were fully successful, the German and the Japanese one. And
just kind of,
yeah,
it was real quick. And insofar as it wasn't fully successful, it's because they were too lax in certain ways. Like,
yeah,
certain people who should not have been allowed to run for office or vote were allowed to. That is the sorts of restrictions that Coates might think of in other contexts as being oppressive. Like, the absence of such things is the reason that, as he points out in another book, they were only 8 years in power. They could have been in power longer if these sorts of restrictions were...
If the demands of justice were taken seriously, if the demands of morality were taken seriously. And what we have in the case of Israel's wars is a kind of immoral moral code, altruism basically, that is saying, yeah, you can't enforce your will. You as the victors, who are the victors in a just war of self-defense, can't pacify and enforce your will on the people you've conquered because you're strong enough that you can't expect them to be able to succeed in wiping you off the map. And so because you can't expect them to be able to succeed in wiping you off the map, you can't do too much to convince them that they can't continue harboring the hope of doing so. You have to allow them to kill a couple of you every now and then. If your missile shields can get most of the missiles down, you can, kill 3 people if they kill 3 of yours, but you can't do anything more. And what that is doing, that moral code, that policy on the part of Israel, the support of that policy on the U.S., by the U.S., and all of the intellectuals who are demanding that kind of policy, this Christian, turn the other cheek, self-effacing, pusillanimous, anti-victory, anti-morality policy, is enabling an immoral society in which you have people raised to nurse their grievances, hate their neighbors, put that above aspirations for a better life for themselves, therefore maintain a society that's a perpetual threat to its neighbors and to the people within it. And by its neighbors, I don't just mean Israel, but all the neighbors, like Jordan and Egypt, don't want much to do with the Palestinians either, right? And leaving these people in a kind of dysfunctional state where they cannot but be miserable. That is really wicked and really evil, and that is the effect of bad ideas. It's a kind of enabling, and that is what altruism does. This is altruism. It's egalitarianism. It's anti-achievement, anti-virtue. And if you want to think about Coates' role in American intellectual life, he's part of, Ibis, you talk about, Black America is not like this. It's got self-esteem. It's trying to do well for it. I think it is true, and that is the essence of it. Like, the Black American thought is primarily American thought, but there's also this Coatesian strand in it that's been there for quite a while. That's not trying to overcome, but trying to nurse grievances and damn the situation for not doing better and justify stagnation. And that's, these threads, and it's not just in it's in every population. It's in the Jews, it's in every population you have that suffered racism or oppression has these two kind of dynamics going on in it. And then which one is the one that's in the ascendancy? And the reason why Coates was able to use Israel as an example of a positive, and the one thing he wrote about something positive happening, right, is precisely because the Jews did build something, right? Now we could talk about respects in which it was bad and wrong and they could have done better and they had these flaws, and there are lots of flaws and mistakes, including too much of this other perpetual victim collectivist tribal mentality in lots of features of Israel, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But that's something that's a parasite on something that's undermining something that's good. And you cannot discuss that badness in a way that's good blind, that's blind to the goodness that it's sapping. And that's, I think, what Coates does. That's the vision that Coates offers of what social justice or racial justice or moral progress is. And it's a vision that is life-sucking.
What I two concretes to flesh out some of the points that were raised. One on the analogy of Reconstruction, and one on the Palestinian community, or what you might describe as the group of people who identify in this way and their leadership and how they relate to each other. So on the issue of an occupation, is there such a thing as a just occupation, an effective occupation? The longest period of Israel's occupation of the West Bank is 1967 to 1994. And then there was a period when the Palestinians took over to start this nascent state, and then it collapsed, and then Israel moved back in incrementally. But that period of 1967 to 1994 is remarkable. There's many things to say about the occupation. One is that the standard of living improved because economic life improved, and so a lot of positives happened under this. But I want to emphasize the things that went wrong. Because this is something I write about in my book, What Justice Demands, and I recommend that people point people to the footnotes, because a lot of things I couldn't include in the text, I include in the footnotes, and it's worth looking at. But some of the things that went wrong about Israel's occupation post-67 resemble some of the things that went wrong with Reconstruction. So there were people who were allowed to run for office or hold office in the Reconstruction period who should not have been. And they were allowed to be part of the sort of local government, civil government. Something similar happened under the Israeli occupation. They allowed some of the sort of community leaders to remain loyal to the Jordanian regime. And they went back and forth, and they were in alliance with the Jordanian regime, which was the power that was previously there. And so those ties were never severed. Moreover, what you see, the idea that you raised, Greg, about this is an unfinished war. It was not a defeated enemy. It was as close to that as you, it was close, but not close enough in this sense. So one of the attitudes the Israelis took, and it's important that their view of this occupation was, in my view, essentially temporizing. They didn't have a long-range vision of what to do. They didn't really know how to manage this. And there's a lot of things went wrong with that. But one of the things that is really alarming is that they were oblivious to the risks of the community of people and the leadership of that community. So what did that mean? Their attitude was, look, they can publish and say whatever they want in the newspaper, so long as they don't overtly call for killing us, which is, not a crazy thought. That's sort of, don't incite violence. That's what you have in many societies. But they went all the way up to the brink and then insisted and sort of, in effect, pushed their ideas into that society. The other piece of it was, they said, well, so long as they don't arm themselves and gain money and use that to kill us. But the laxness of the occupation was such that they did get armed. They did arms. And then that's when the Palestinian movement, trying to mobilize that community, took up arms and then started attacking from within the occupied area. So it was such an ineffective occupation that they were able to arm themselves despite the occupying power being so much more powerful and so much more pervasive. And throughout, the occupation started off with a hands-off. We don't want them to see us, very passive in the shadows. They put their offices in side streets. It wasn't a driving through the streets with tanks to show a force. It was they started off with the opposite. And what happened is, in reaction to growing hostility that was fomented by the Palestinian movement, they had to step up patrols. They had to increase security. So as occupations go, it was not effective and it was not well thought out. And it was right for them to be in a position of enforcing military rule. I think that's true. But it was partly a symptom of a war that was not finished. And just one other quick point to illustrate the kind of grievance mongering or grievance pimping, as you put it, Greg, that Coates embodies. The archetype of this is what the Palestinian leadership, both the more secular leaning PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the more Islamist Hamas and the other factions in that axis do, which is they nurse in people hopes that cannot be realized. So there are people walking around with keys to houses that don't exist. And they've been told that one day they will have a so-called right of return and they will go and unlock the house that does not exist. And they built up a fantasy world for people. And the effect of it is to nurse grievances that are, many of them are unfounded. But even if they're founded, they're not resolvable by the means that this movement is telling people to take up arms and turn their children into killers. So there's a whole narrative that the Palestinian community lives under. It's marinating it from television to schools to newspapers to radio, in every direction, that this one day, all of the people who were once, or whose ancestors were once in this land, will return. And there's an allusion to this in the Coates book about they've been denied their right of return. There is no such right. There is no such right of return. It's entirely the prerogative of the power, the regime that takes over a piece of land, to decide who's allowed back and under what conditions and of what kind of risk profile. But merely the nursing of this hope of a right of return for Palestinians is evidence that there's no concern with rectifying any actual wrongs, and there's a fetishizing again of nursing people's suffering and making them wallow in it, as opposed to orienting them to, this is 75 years ago. You need to think about the future. You need to think about your life and take it seriously and do something different and find another way to live that's better for you, because this is an unchangeable fact. You can't go back and rewrite history. And yet that is the narrative the Palestinian community, because of its leadership, has been living under. And that is cruel. And what Coates is doing is not merely echoing it. He's laundering it. And he's making it a model for what people in the US who are taking him seriously as a moral, intellectual figure, this is the way to think about this. And it's exactly the opposite. This is not healthy psychologically. And it's morally repugnant to tell that to people. To wallow in an unwarranted suffering and not point them towards what positives they could achieve and could look to in their lives. And there's nothing like that.
And if, like Coates, you tell people that the end of that story is always you being unjust to other people, what you inhibit is exactly what the Palestinians need, which is a Theodore Herzl of their own. Like that kind of constructive figure, a Herzl, a Madison, but Herzl is a better, I think, and also more provocative. Only someone like the founder of Zionism, but for the Palestinian cause, like that's the kind of construction that's needed. But Coates, as he makes clear in the beginning of the essay, he thinks that kind of project is, if not doomed to fail, suspicious, and that you often end up harming another group by trying to do it.
As he's suspicious of his own, if he was placed in such a situation, there was a kind of viral clip about, he's maybe suspicious about what he would do if he was under such situations and what evils he would commit. And he doesn't know how he'd, morally process, the situation of the Palestinians and what he would, and how he could see himself possibly, or he doesn't know maybe how he would react as one of these younger people in this society, which I think some of it's understandable, but it's also troubling that he doesn't see a way to process a hard situation and not come out of it, as a trained killer who's trying to, recover some glory in the name of Allah or, what have you.
Note that there you have this infinite patience and understanding for the people of the West Bank who resort to terrorism. I don't know that I wouldn't do the same thing if I was in their situation, if I grew up like that, etc. There's infinite patience and understanding for them. And this condescending pseudo-patience and understanding for the Jews. My father, he named me Ta-Nehisi because he nursed this stupid fantasy about Egypt and whatever, and I can see through that now. And, Ibrahim over here has got that same kind of idea when he goes to the Kingdom of David or whatever. There's a kind of condescension in his attitude towards the Israelis precisely because they're successful at something, right? And this infinite patience in his understanding of the Hamas types, but no sense of what would actually be a healthy or a rational or a proper or a way that represented achieving something in your life and in your person view of this. Maybe it's to be like him and to be sort of in effect cynical and posing as moralistic, but not thinking anything is achievable on Earth. That's good. What is the option? And there isn't a view of it. I want to ask though, what do we make of the things that he points out as signs of the kind of Redeemer or apartheid-like or Jim Crow-like features that he sees in Israeli society and sees as and is horrified by? Like, are these things not real? Are they real and fine? Are they exaggerated? Is he right about them, but he's taking them out of context? It might be different answers for different ones. But what did you make about? He's bearing witness to what he saw there. What do we make of that account?
I'll say a few things on this because many of the things he's writing about and pointing to, I write about and I talk about in my book, and some of it's in the text, some of it's in the footnotes, because there are real problems in Israeli society, and I come to this from the perspective of an individualist, someone who takes the life of the individual seriously, that society should be shaped around individual rights, and that's the primary. And taking that framework, I do think there are problems with the way Israeli society has handled both the laws around land, there's sort of tribalism around access to land, and I'll talk about some examples of this, and I think it's important. And of course, people can take a look at the book, and I talk about some of the ways in which these have been handled, how to think about them. I think the widest way to answer your question, Greg, is that and I think he said this in some of the interviews since the book came out, is he thought this would be complicated, but it's actually simple. And the reality is exactly the opposite. He wants it to be simple, but to think morally and seriously about values and human life, you have to untangle complexity, which doesn't mean you throw your hands up and say, it's too complicated, I don't know what to do, which is one way in which people use complexity as a refuge from thinking. But the complexity is just what is there in the universe, and that you have to deal with that. You can't evade it and just decide what you want to be true. And the complexity is, just take a couple of examples of this. So nowhere in the book does he tell you what a settlement is, or a settler. And the problem is that a settler is at least an ambiguous term, and I would argue that it's what Ayn Rand would call a package deal. It's a term that puts together things that are essentially dissimilar. And here's some of the evidence for that. So a settlement can mean a neighborhood that's built, like houses that's built on land that was acquired in a war of self-defense, and that is built there and kept for the sake of self-defense in perpetuity. So that's one kind of settlement, and that's, I think, a defensible kind of settlement. And you can argue about what should be done to the people who might have owned the land before that, but do they have a claim? But that's one kind of settlement. Another kind of settlement, which he writes about, is people show up and pitch tents on land that's not theirs. The ownership of that land is known. It's maybe a Palestinian, and they squat on that land. And then what they do is they call the local police or the local mayor, and they use their political pull, and they demand security. Oh, we're settling here. And they create a de facto neighborhood on land that belongs to other people. And then there's and that's wrong. That's immoral. That's expropriating people, and it's using the government's power in unjust ways. And it's wrong for there to be this kind of ability to use government in this way. And I think that that's a failing in the Israeli society. And this is something that you might call, in American context, in colloquially we call this cronyism. Like you know someone, you have political pull, or maybe one of your settlers is part of the local government and they're able to influence things in your direction. That is wrong, and that is an unjust situation. So those are two kinds of settlements. And you could continue to differentiate what a settlement is, because but you can't evaluate them unless you know what you're talking about. You can't treat them as identical morally or even legally, because they do have different legal standings. And the means by which you establish one of these things is important, and the context and where it's located. Has there been an unjust taking of the land? So you have to know about that, and you have to be able to differentiate. And this is, again, this is not there's a way in which you can talk about this, and people, it gets technical, and there's issues about land law that you have to know. The point is not to come up with a sophistry or a casuist argument to justify things. The point is to understand and evaluate when is something justified morally and legally, and when is it not. But when you put them together and you treat them as if they're both equally wrong, you're doing something inappropriate. That's not how to think about these cases. And nowhere in the book do you get any sense that there is a range of things that the term settler or settlement refers to. So some of my family live in an apartment building. They've been there 30, 40 plus years. Technically, it's a settlement, but it does not look like any settlement that he's describing. And so that's one kind of example where you need to think about the details and conceptualize them properly, and by means of a values and what would be right to do here and what would be wrong to do here, and who's at fault and how do you redress it. So take an example I started with, people just pitching tents and shacks and declaring a settlement and expropriating the land from someone who owns it already, and using the police and then the military to enforce their unjust seizure of this land, which happened. A number of times this has happened. And a number of times the courts in Israel have prevailed on the police and the local authorities, who sometimes are complicit with these people, to remove them and to restore the land to its proper owner. Now, that is something remarkable. Now, the point here is not to find a silver lining. The point is to say, if you have a society where that is possible, you have to think about that. That's a virtue of a society where they can see a wrong and take steps to rectify it. Now, it's going to be difficult to rectify some of these, but the fact that it's possible is remarkable. And nowhere do you hear anything about it. And these are not obscure cases. They go to the Supreme Court. They're in the headlines. You can easily find them. And people who have fought these cases, it is not an easy fight, but they can win, and they have won. And the people who have settled there unjustly, the squatters maybe is the better term for it, they have been removed, and they should be punished more, not just removed. Now, that is part of what it looks like to think about some of the problems that exist in Israel. So that's one kind of issue that I think there isn't any semblance of concern for that level of fact and how to evaluate it. There's just a handy slogan, settlement, which is morally loaded, and it's supposed to do a lot of work without actually connecting you to the facts and to the relevant moral context. So I think that's one kind of problem that you definitely point to. I want to mention one other, which he emphasizes, and I'm interested in your reactions to this as well. So there's a case where a fanatical Israeli Jew went into a mosque. This happened in the 1980s, I believe, and he shot it up. It's like a mass shooting. He killed a lot of people, and he was overpowered by the worshippers who killed him. And Coates goes to a neighborhood, a settlement, Kiryat Arba, where there is a park, I think, or some sort of memorial to this guy. And Coates points out, well, look, the Israeli government disavowed this man, they denounced him, and yet they allow this park to be named after him, and there's subsidies for this neighborhood, there's subsidies for the park. So how could they seriously think anyone should take them at their word that they really are not behind this kind of action? I don't know the details of how they ended up subsidizing this, but a lot of the neighborhoods are subsidized and a lot of parks are. So it's not clear to me that there's something special about that particular, but it's obscene. No government should enable the lionizing of a mass murderer, which is what that man was. Now, this is a notable case in Israeli history. It was a harrowing event, and it was widely denounced, and not just perfunctorily the way he wants you to believe. And that's a problem. And there are religious fanatical Jews who will kill people because they're messianic, and those people are a tiny number of the society, and they're hated by a lot of people, which is relevant. Now, I want to turn the story over, because he can point to one park which egregiously is named to celebrate a murderer. One park where this happens, and it shouldn't exist. I'm against this. I didn't know it existed, and I take him at his word that this is the actual situation. But tell me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, about the streets and the squares and the parks and the schools and the TV documentaries and the posters that lionize not one guy who committed an atrocity, but people who systematically over decades committed atrocities, mass murders, suicide bombings, and who are praised and celebrated not because of one incidental case where there was a subsidy to enable this to happen, but officially and openly and without shame, because that is what the community, and particularly its political intellectual leaders, believe to be the right thing to do. Now, you can't tell a story about this conflict and say there's this one park in one town and there's a subsidy to celebrate this guy, and that's obscene, which it is, and not tell everybody who's interested in the truth of this matter that this is the default behavior. This is the expected and wide-scale systematic way of celebrating mass murder and atrocities within the Palestinian community. That kind of omission is what I mean by this is egregiously non-objective.
This is related to a theme in the book, because I can imagine what he would say if he were here. Oh, here you are, Israeli apologist coming with your civilization versus savagery narrative. You're saying the Palestinian people are savage, and they do this, and they celebrate this, and whatever, and I don't want to hear it, and so forth. And it's the same as when any colonizer has this narrative about the people. But this idea of a civilization versus savagery narrative, and that you want to dismiss it, is basically the dismissal of the idea of goodness. The idea that there is a way that a civilization could be that represents progress, that represents achievement, that represents attainment, and it includes not lionizing mass murderers. You have that standard covertly in the background when you want to put down the civilized societies by saying they don't live up to their own ideals, but you don't actually embrace those ideals, saying that a society that does live up to them is better than one that doesn't even try to, right? And so you can use these kinds of ideals of civilization to put down Israel, to put down America, but you don't actually hold them as universal ideals, and therefore you don't hold it as a real achievement that a society has embraced them and shaped itself around them, however imperfectly, such that we could use them to push back on it. And occasionally he says things that show that he is aware of that as an issue, but that what he's trading on. But he never takes those standards, or takes seriously the idea that you might use those standards to say that one country is better than another. One culture, one way of life, one society, one community is better than another. He takes it as tantamount to racism and victim blaming to say that there's something wrong with the way that the Palestinian society is living.
So the issue with civilization and savagery, why he can effectively dismiss it, has been because they have been wielded by racists and often still are, and but just reading through history, and particularly reading about the European Enlightenment, and you could see that the Europeans themselves were really concerned, and the way they put it was with norms of civilization, being more civilized, and being more or less barbarous. And sometimes, yes, it was a racist dismissal of how the Indians were living or whatever, but more often than not, they were critiquing themselves. They were thinking to themselves, look, we were barbarous in the Middle Ages, stuck under, the superstition of monks and of kings and whatever, and here's how we're becoming better. And they were sort of self-conscious of that improvement. And what's unfortunate is it seems like that kind of like, here's an episode of history where a big part of what people meant by being civilized or savage wasn't overtly racial, or at least had an element in it that wasn't racial at all. And where it was just Europeans criticizing Europeans for having lived under their version of theocracies. And that is just completely ignored. Now we have to pretend that the only way somebody could dismiss a civilization as savage is if he was being covertly racist and didn't want to say it outright. But there's a lot that you lose, and there's a lot that you lose in understanding how Europe developed and how it became freer and how it became better if you think that there wasn't this self-conscious civilizing process going on.
I think what stuck out to me on this kind of same vein is like, we mentioned it earlier, the non-mentioning of achievements, or not the non-view of achievements, of these things as achievements. And I always find it interesting when I see a lot of these conversations critiquing, people who are saying, this is a civilization versus barbarism type thing. We've talked a lot about it, but there's no concrete view of the moral political infrastructures that make up a society. So Coates does not see or mention the importance of having things like a rule of law, a due process system, a separation of powers in the government, a secularized government. So for him, there's kind of an equivocation on Israel being a theocracy and the kind of theocratic views of Palestine, or the almost, as I understand it from most of Elan's work, the almost non-existent rule of law in areas like Gaza and Palestine versus a very, very robust but flawed, but robust system of rule of law that happens in Israel. I mean, I've heard it mentioned, which make it possible to produce things like medical innovation and, productive ventures that are possible in Israel. There's no credence given to what makes these things possible and even what these things are. And there's no serious grappling. He just dismisses the civilization versus barbarism critique without actually grappling with, well, what are the adornments or things that make up civilization, and how has and this is more of like my thing on historical, how has this, if we're so focused on history and how things have developed in this kind of comparative history, one who's taking that seriously would notice America is a major step. As Mohammed mentioned, the European Enlightenment is a major step. America is a major step. I hold the development in America through the 1800s and up into the Civil War as major steps in moving towards that. In fact, there's great work done on what happens, on how the impact of the Black struggle and the Reconstruction thought impacted the rest of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a loose connection somewhere in there to how we get to a place like Israel existing, because the world was made a better place by certain ideas spreading through better people and creating better institutions. This, makes no appearance in Coates's kind of worldview.
And when you say better people, you mean the most independent-minded, thoughtful people in all sorts of different populations. You don't mean
exactly.
And it's those people are being betrayed if you dismiss any talk of like
of civilization.
Civilizations could improve, right? Because it's not like these. There's a real sense in which the Middle East got way worse after the 70s than it was, like, say, in the 30s or 20s. And there were definitely, like, liberal and modernizers throughout these areas. And there's a story about what ended up undercutting them and ended up emboldening first the nationalists and then the Islamists. But if you really dismiss this notion that, like, countries are more or less barbarous and can improve, like that there's a real process there, those people, you undercut them, they lose. They get called traitors, they get silenced, and they don't get the kind of support that they would need from Westerners or people who have a real interest in having them prevail in those societies. If you dismiss all of that as just racism or colonialism or whatever you call it, those are the ones that lose, and we're all the worse for it.
I mean, the whole idea of racism being bad, which is a true idea, right? And tribalism being bad, which is a true idea, are features of a certain society developing in a certain point in its thinking, right? The idea of individualism, the idea of primacy of reason, the idea of character matters, and character is not something that's passed on through the blood, nor is it passed on in some unintelligible way through culture and tradition. It might in concrete ways be passed on, but not in a way that you can't understand and figure out what it is. And these are the good bits of the tradition. And I can throw out the bad ones, right? This idea of valuing reason, valuing individualism, this is a hard-won achievement of certain people at certain times that were able to spread it throughout certain cultures. The default is tribalism. The default is racism, whether it's the literal kind of racism where you're dividing people into races or just ethnicities or tribes, but people hating on one another for not looking like them, for not having the same parents. This is the default of all civilizations at all times until fairly recently. And it's never been wholly gotten out of the way. It was definitely a part of Europe in the Enlightenment to have this kind of tribalism and racism. But what distinguished Europe in the Enlightenment and America in its founding and so forth is not its racialism and tribalism and irrationality, but the fact that those things stood out by contrast to an ideal, an articulate ideal of an alternative to that. Right. So that we can say, whoa, what America is doing with slavery is an abomination and horrible and in contradistinction to its principles. Likewise, what Europe's doing in this place and that place and how people were treated in the Congo and so forth. We have a standard against which we can appreciate the barbarism and evil and savagery of what the European powers and what America was doing. But if you give up on that idea of a distinction between civilization and savagery, between and the idea of the civilization as being individualistic, you don't have a basis to make these moral judgments. And you have to be able to see, like, these evil elements exist in every civilization, including the best ones. They've never been vanquished, but you can't use that as a reason to dismiss the civilization and see it on par with its opposites. And you also can't take the people who are victims of the injustices that are being committed by the society and assume that they are free of this kind of evil themselves. Indeed, often they're dominated by it. Now, Coates realizes that being oppressed doesn't give you a pass and make it such that you can't do any harm, right? He thinks, oh, if we actually had Wakanda, or if the kingdom of the blacks that my father envisioned, came true, it would be like Israel and it would oppress people. But that's because he's against actually thinking a success could come to pass. It's not because he thinks there's actually a hard-won real ideal that's been recognized in America and in some other countries and is part of Israel's DNA and so forth, that we need to defend and use as the grounds for the positive. And the things that he, we talk about the ways in which things, some of the settlements have been fought, the legitimate ones have been fought in Israeli courts. We could talk about some of the ways in which racism was fought within the American system. Again, not complete, not perfect, not finished. But if you think about it, like Ida B. Wells, who he claims to admire, but I think is an opposite of Coates. Like, she did something, she brought to attention lynching. She brought to attention the complicity of local and state governments in it. She made cases, she made it, working through the American
organizations.
And organizations, working through the American values, the American system. She was able to do a lot, and others like her, she wasn't alone, to address this evil. But it depended on the values that the country was founded on. Likewise, Douglass, a lot of, and it's not even that they were individualists and capitalists in the sense they want, even the kind of socialists.
Yeah.
And like, if you look at the biographies of most African-American intellectuals, they go through a socialist phase and they go away from it, like every intellectual in the 20th century. They had some positive ideal that was, they were seeing something they thought was good about American culture or European culture. They were like, here's what it would be to fully do it. And sometimes it was wrong, but they were at least looking for something positive in it, and then by that standard judging, rather than rejecting and trying to level society.
I think a small thing to add on that is, like, just real quick, he throughout the book and throughout his talks, he mentions some of these black heroes and all this type of thing, but there's little mention of how much of a kind of guiding light the Declaration of Independence was for them, which I feel like maybe should have got a mention in this book a little bit. No mention of the Declaration of Independence or its principles, or, how it could serve as a guiding light. Even when he's asked about a solution, maybe you'd figure that idea would come up, the idea of equality for all in terms of their rights or anything like that. But he's very dismissive of the idea of rights, even unless it's, in this kind of social justice kind of way.
So, Greg, I wonder if we can sort of pull some of the threads together and offer some closing thoughts. I want to make one point that didn't come up and just see what you guys think, and we can wrap up with this. One of the points that he raises is I'm speaking for the voiceless. The Palestinians don't have a voice, and that's why I think that's his answer to people who say, why aren't you looking at the whole picture? It says, I'm not interested in the whole picture. I just wanted to speak for the voices. And I think there's both an epistemological point there that's really worth exploring. The one that I wanted to start with is I find that ludicrous because it's exactly the opposite. The impression I have is there's a vast literature by and about Palestinians in academic circles. There's a popular literature that you can find in bookstores. I mean, massive numbers of books, and I've read many of them. And in the news, and this is the point that he really harps on, because he's a journalist and he feels betrayed by his fellow journalists. They've told him a story that's just not true, and how could they have just been silent about all these? And the actual, I think, an objective account of how journalism treats this conflict is exactly the opposite. It's like there's just a skewed perspective towards the Palestinians. If there's any kind of laundering of reputations or laundering, it's more on the side of laundering the Palestinian community and leadership. And interesting work done on this is by someone who was a journalist in this area. His name's Matty Friedman. He's written 2 articles. One appears in The Atlantic many years ago. And it's just his experience of there are stories he was not allowed to file because they were inconvenient to the narrative. Like he went to a university and he saw all these students marching with the Hamas flag. And he said, well, I have to write about this. And his editor said, no, this is not the sort of thing we want. This just doesn't fit. And he thought, well, what is my job here? And so that's just one example of how that it's what he's experiencing. Some of it, I think, is just the shame or guilt within his community, like his friends maybe have shamed him for not knowing enough. But the notion that the Palestinian position has not been given voice is so far from the truth. It's ridiculous. And then I think I'm interested in your perspective on sort of the epistemological side of thinking of that as a legitimate way to approach this issue to the exclusion of objectivity.
Well, I mean, I don't think Coates really thinks there is such a thing as objectivity in journalism. Not in the sense that we mean objectivity of an active-minded search for the truth. So if you think of his progression as a journalist as he thinks about it, he grew up in this kind of Black nationalist household that had these kind of, literature that his father read, and it probably wasn't by his later standards very objective, but it had, our people are this and our people are that, and these stories and myths they told themselves. And through that, he acquired this kind of sense and understanding of oppressed peoples and of humanity. A lot of people have seen more of the world than I have, but I've seen deeper, I've seen the humanity of it because I have this gift, and he calls it a gift, of having been embedded in this oppressed community that lived on the margins of democracy. Okay, so he's got that. Then he goes to journalism school, and he works in newsrooms, and he learns these methods of fact-checking and all this stuff, and these procedures of objectivity, and that makes him more convincing in some ways. It gives him, he gets something out of that. But he sees it, and at a certain time, he pictures himself as, now I've got this scientific method, and I could know the truth, and that's kind of objectivity, in quote. You look at both sides, and you do this, and you fact check, and you have footnotes, etc. And he thinks there's something that came out of that. He had people who could help him do research and dot the I's and cross the T's. But when he was too into that, he was, one, being influenced by the moral narrative in the newsroom. There are Zionists there and Jews there and no Palestinians, so whatever. So that's part of what he thinks is going on. But the other part of it is there's this idea, and you heard a lot of this during from leftists during the Trump period, right? That, well, there's something wrong with this both sides approach. You interview people on both sides and somehow you're objective. And there is something wrong or simplistic about that. Like you figure out the two sides, and whoever, one guy's lying and one guy's telling the truth, but you quote them all equally. And therefore you say you're objective because you've done both sides. So he takes that kind of cartoon of objectivity and he rejects it. And then what's there in its place? Well, I have to meditate on this ability to see the evil and humanity of suffering. And if I go around and spend time with the most dispossessed and voiceless people and tune into my gift that I had been skeptical of, because then I'll be able to see with moral clarity the truth. You'll have this insight into the truth if maybe you're among the elect that got persecuted in the right way, such that you have the ability to just see it, and then you'll have moral clarity. But there's no idea of actual intellectual work to uncover moral truth and the moral truth of the situation. There is a kind of work of embedding yourself with the people and having it wash over you, but only certain people, the ones you regard as voiceless. And there's no issue of actually intellectually understanding not both sides as though there are only two, but all the arguments on all the sides of the questions, all the facts that go into these narratives, and then rationally figuring out what narrative is true. That's not something he thinks he has attention to, right? There's rather, we construct myths and narratives, and if you hang out with the aggrieved people enough, you'll come to see the truth in their myth if it's there. That's his approach to journalism, and it's
and
not
history,
objective.
might add.
What say?
That's his approach to journalism and history, and his people of his ilk. It's a large problem in the 1619 Project, this Black Voices history, which has, like you said, it has its good, but it definitely has its bad.
And what the call to action, or what this leads to, is basically we talked about what I was calling grievance pimping, and you were talking about causing people to nurse a hopeless fantasy of a return or whatever. But there are two parts to it. It's even worse than nursing a hopeless fantasy. It's sacrificing their lives to it. So think about the story he tells at the end of this a man who grew up in a town that was taken over by the Israelis. I don't know the exact history of that town, but he's lived different places, and now he's a businessman, and he has a family and lots of grandkids, and he's living somewhere in Chicago. And he believes whatever he believes about the history and what should happen. But you think about this guy, he's seemingly had a successful life somewhere else. He's got this maybe view of what should happen in Palestine, or that his grandkids should someday come back to this land. And maybe it's a delusion, maybe it's false, maybe it's hopeless, maybe it's equivalent to some religious myth that the Jews had about what the warrant for them is in establishing themselves in the Holy Land, which I think is a religious myth and not justified, right? That's not why it's good that there's an Israeli state, that something happened in Exodus or whatever. But this is a person who's lived a life for himself, and he's had this myth going on in it, but that's not the essence of his life. Whether your view of what a just future would be is for your people or for a community that you view yourself as part of, whether that's rational or not, whether it's true or not, whether it's possible or not, whether it's just or not, there's also the question of, are you integrating it in the right way to a life that you're trying to live for yourself, and that you're trying to encourage the other people who you see as part of the group that you feel has been unjustly persecuted, right? Even if you're right about what should happen, are you sacrificing your life and trying to train your kids to sacrifice their lives to this cause? Are you in a culture that's valuing martyrdom? Or are you trying to live a good life for yourself, trying to encourage the people in your orbit and who you have influence over to lead the best lives for themselves, and in the context of doing that, to pursue what kind of justice is possible to achieve over past wrongs? And the latter is the right thing, and even over present continuing wrongs. Like, are you going to be defined in every way by the fact that you are a victim of some kind of tribal injustice, and your whole life is going to be about fighting it, whether or not you have any prospect of winning the fight in your life? Or are you going to make your life about achieving the best life for you, with fighting against, overcoming, getting rectification for whatever kinds of injustices you think happened and are rectifiable in the context of that life? And I think the whole Palestinian movement is really become about sacrificing one's life to these claims of justice for one's people. And I think that even if the claims were justified, and for some particular ones they might be, although I think the whole story is not, That is a deep mistake, and it amounts to a call to sacrifice. And you're never going to be able to achieve any kind of justice that way. You're never going to be able to achieve any kind of happiness that way. All you're going to be able to achieve is martyrdom. And it's whether it's literal martyrdom, you've blown yourself up for Allah or whatever, or the equivalent of having sacrificed your life. And for some mystical, what amounts to a mystical consideration. And I think this is what Coates is standing for in this piece. I think it's what he stands for more and more. And it's a large part of what's wrong and bad in the world.
It's a good point on which to end.